Welcome to the fourth instance in the Open Source Developers at Google Speaker Series, which is our talks sessions designed to give the public insights into what open source developers who have been hired by Google are doing in their daily lives. This evening we are privileged to have with us Ben Collins-Sussman and Brian Fitzpatrick, who are two of the engineers behind our project hosting feature on Google Code Site, as well as Subversion developers, and they are here to talk to you about how your open source project can survive poisonous people. Take it away, gents.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks, Leslie.
Go ahead.
So, you have the remote.
Oh, all right, great. Here we go.
So we'll start off with who are we? We have not forgotten who we are. My name is Brian Fitzpatrick. Ben and I are currently Google engineers in Chicago, and we both work on the back end of the Google code hosting as well as other bits and pieces of things related to open source here at Google.
Yeah, and we should talk about the next slide, which is the fact that these are opinions that we've come to on our own after many years of sort of participating in open source projects. And we found these issues coming up over and over again, so we decided to put a talk together, and it's gone pretty well for us. So obviously this is not the only way to run a community. It's the way that we've found to be the best way that we think. And so we're trying to share that with you guys, and maybe do a little group therapy, and get some Q&A after the session. This book is written by a friend of ours named Carl Fogel, and we recommend it highly. It talks about a lot of the things we're talking about, as well as even more details, technical details about running a project. And we recommend it if you don't have it already. And yeah, I think that's all we need to say.
Yeah.
Great. Should we move on?
Move on. So we'll start off with do a quick overview of what we're going to look at. There's 4 different stages that we visit in protecting your project. The first stage is comprehension, to understand what poisonous people are, what we need to protect against in the first place. Beyond that is how do you fortify your project against poisonous people? You obviously want to attract other people to your project to work on it, but not necessarily the poisonous kind. How do you identify those poisonous people? And lastly, if your project's already infected, how do you get them out? And every one of those is a certain level of trickiness to it, I would have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about understanding the threat. So you've got your open source project. What is the most important resource? It's not your hardware. It's the attention and focus of your community. And this is what you are trying to protect in the first place from the poisonous people. There's a limited resource here, right? If 20 people are trying to implement 20 hugely divergent features at once, or if everybody's squabbling all the time, you will get nowhere in your project. So what is wrong with poisonous people? Go ahead.
So poisonous people will show up and they'll distract your developers from doing productive work. They can cause emotional drain because they'll start infighting or squabbling or that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And what they do is basically you're going down a certain road and they're going to either stop you, slow you down, or try and turn you off a different road. And some people do this on purpose. Some people would do this on accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So paralysis. This is the problem. If you not always, I guess the best way to say this is these people who are disrupting your progress are not always doing it intentionally. In fact, I think it's more often that they're doing it unintentionally. They are so into the project and they want it to be so perfect that they will actually end up hurting you with their perfectionism, or people trying to get the process just perfect. And this is one of the people in our project actually says we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that's sort of become, at least for the Subversion project, that's sort of become one of our watch phrases. And I guess there's an example we had where I guess somebody proposed a feature, and I won't go into details, but there is a certain person in the Subversion project who does fantastic stuff. We love him, but we ended up sort of pushing at the design document. It went on for weeks and then months. And it became clear that it was never going to be, no one was ever going to start coding this process, and because this one person would not let the design document go, would not stop picking at it. So ultimately, in a situation like that, the best thing you can do is get support from a large percentage of developers in the project. And if they're happy with it, somebody just needs to sit down and code it and ignore the noisy minority. And
one of the things that we like to talk about here, we have a lot of different catchphrases that we pull out in Subversion when we need to sort of set the talk down and get going with the doing. And one of those is we talk about painting the bike shed. Who here knows what painting the bike shed means? Any BSD folks in the room? All right, so painting the bike shed. I'll give you a quick overview on this. Back in the BSD days, Paul Henning Camp wrote this wonderful email. They were having this huge fight over whether sleep should take seconds or microseconds, I believe, or seconds or milliseconds. It went on and on and on and on and on. And so the way he described it was that if you're going to build a nuclear power plant, these guys go off, do all this research, bring this gargantuan binder of information to the board, and they say, we're going to build a nuclear power plant. And the board of the electric company looks at it like, oh yeah, looks great, go ahead and build the nuclear power plant. And 2 weeks later, they come in and they say, look, we got this nuclear power plant, we're building it. The workers want a little bike shed for them to keep their bikes in so the rain doesn't get on the bikes.
Here are the blueprints.
Yeah, and so here's this picture, this little bike shed we're going to draw. And it will go, the discussion of what color to paint this bike shed will take forever. So to distill that down is that the amount of discussion on a particular feature is inversely proportional to its complexity. And we've definitely seen, do you have a question?
No, just want this to be attributed to its proper holder, Northcote Parkinson, the economist.
Yeah.
The guy who, this is fourth Parkinson law.
This is the fourth Parkinson law.
I've never heard of that, okay.
Parkinson law?
No.
He said it to attribute it to its original, author of this idea was Parkinson.
Never heard of it.
This is known as the fourth law of Parkinson.
Yeah, it's just the fact that in a group, people are really, when they're working in a committee, people want to put their stamp and sort of prove like I'm participating. See, and it's very easy to put your opinion in on blueprints for a bike shed than to put your opinion in on blueprints for a power plant.
So we tend to call people early and often when they're bike shedding or something, or we'll even call ourselves. I'd prefer to have this way, but it's total bike shed. And our friend Carl set up actually www.bikeshed.com, and you can pick just about any normal color and go color.bikeshed.com, and you'll get that color. It's lovely.
So, don't get bogged down in perfectionism. That's the moral of the slide. So let's talk about fortifying against the threat. How do you keep your open source community resistant to infection? And this is sort of, this section of our talk, we're going to talk just about things that, habits that we think make very healthy open source communities. Very prescriptive. So these are the 4 things, I'm just going to flip them up, the 4 things that we think make a healthy open source community. And you would be surprised if you take a poll of open source projects, how many are missing one or more of these elements.
Or all.
Or all of them. If they're missing all of them, they don't last very long. But most problems that you find in open source projects can be traced back to a deficiency in one of these things. So let's go into some detail. Why don't you talk about it, Fitz?
All right, so best practice. Now, this is one of the things that I preach day to day around here when I'm talking to people about open source something, is have a mission, have a direction. If you go out there and you want to just write some software, well, that's great. But if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to know where you're there when you finally get there. So first thing I tell people to do is pick a direction. So where are you going to go? And then limit your direction with a scope so that you don't wind up in limitless feature creep. Or people adding a lot of things on that you didn't intend to do. So you really have to think about where you want to go with your project. And I have a couple of examples of projects that I've personally been involved with. And the first one, obviously, is Subversion. And this is Subversion's mission statement. It was on the front page of the Subversion project for 6 years. Well, at least it was the first 4 years. It was very relevant as we worked towards 1.0. And that saved us a lot of grief. We'd have somebody come up and say, yeah, you guys, you're going to write this new version control system. We have to integrate Make with it and a compiler, and it should print pretty pictures and do PNG to JPEG conversion.
And it should do clear case features.
Exactly.
Everything.
and so we could point back to this and say, look, we're going to write a version control system, but our limiter is that we're trying to write CVS without the cruddy features or the cruddy misfeatures or the bugs.
Right, and in fact, we actually enumerated the exact features we wanted and the exact problems with CVS that we were trying to address. So from day one, if somebody came along with a suggestion to the list, we could say, it's on our list or it's not on our to-do list. And if it's not on the to-do list, we say, thanks, come back later after 1.0, and we can talk.
So this is it's a way for you to communicate with new developers coming to your project. This is what we're doing. If you want to take part in this, that's great. Please join us. If you're not interested, then save your own time and ours and go somewhere else, basically. The second project is the Google Web Toolkit, which I had the honor of working with this team and helping them bring their project completely open source from stem to stern this December. And I talked with those guys, and I gave them this sort of same talk. I said, let's pick a direction and a scope and refine that, make that as clear as we can, because people are going to want to come along and work with you guys but we want to make sure that they're working with you and not against you. So as you can see, the direction that they chose is, the no compromise AJAX development environment.
In Java.
In Java, the scope limitation they chose was Java and a modern browser. So that sets the stage for some of the things they want to do and some of the things they don't want to do. And like the Subversion project, they go on to explain what this means and what it doesn't mean. So what are the goals and non-goals for the project?
So this is basically, you're ensuring that your community has something to focus on. If you're trying to preserve attention and focus, the best way to do that is to have something to focus on, right? I mean, that's it. On mailing lists, this is a problem. I mean, this is your main communication method, right, in any open source project. I mean, you have IRC or instant message, but majority of official communication really happens on mailing lists. And these are just some general practices we've run into. When people come along to mailing lists, point them to the archives. Do not let them reopen old discussions unless they really know what they're talking about and they've really seen the former discussion. Because if they come along and they say, let's talk about X, Y, and Z, and they haven't read the previous discussions, it's just a matter of disrespect. They're disrespecting everyone else's time in the project. So don't let that happen. Another thing that you'll see happening is sometimes if there's dissent in a discussion, you'll see one very vehement dissenter who will sit there the entire time and respond to every single mail in the thread to anyone who disagrees with him. Even people who do agree with him, he will keep replying to every. And so you'll end up with a thread with 50 messages in it, and exactly half of them are from the same person, and it's ridiculous. We call it, yes, filibustering. And we'll call people out on that. We'll say, you know what, read the thread, think about your response carefully, write a nice single response so we can keep going. It's sort of a technique of making it look like there's more dissension when there is, and you should not let that happen.
It's a technique that poisonous people can use to derail a consensus-based community from actually achieving consensus. Because, like Ben said, you have this noisy minority. They're making a lot of noise, and people look and say, oh, wow, there seems to be no agreement on this. And if you look carefully, you see that the no agreement is coming from one person, while 7 or 8 other people likely agree on something.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so documentation is really important. If you don't document things, first of all, the first part of the documentation is your sort of direction, your mission. The second part is what else? How else can you communicate with people about what you're doing and what you want to do? So design decisions, that's your design docs, what you're going to do with your software. Bug fixes, documenting what you fixed, how you fixed it.
Just having an issue tracker at all.
Just having an issue tracker at all, right. Documenting your mistakes. So this is something that people frequently overlook. Because who wants to document your mistakes? Who wants to spend time writing up, we went down this path, found it was a dead end, and then backed up and kept going on? Well, the problem is if you don't document this, whether it's even just in your mailing list archives or you write about it somewhere or blog it or whatever not, someone's going to come back and want to have this discussion all over again, and that's going to distract from your focus and needlessly take up your energy.
And of course, not everybody in the project is going to be there forever. So you might imagine a time when the people participating now will be replaced by a completely different set of people who will want that history to look at. So,
right.
Yeah.
And code changes, of course. Yeah. We recommend picking a standard format for your log messages that people should follow. And interesting, in the past, Ben and I worked at a different company where we dealt with different clients, and we said, yeah, you should use this. You should use a method to have some sort of way of people writing consistent log messages. And this guy said, I can't get my developers to write consistent log messages. And our friend Carl just about choked on his own tongue because he's like, I have an open source project over here with 35 unpaid volunteers who followed this insanely detailed log message specification for every check-in that they do. So don't tell me that you have a problem with your paid developers and I can get these people coming off the internet for free to do this.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. That's cute. Yeah. Okay, so we get that. So code collaboration. This is something that if you participate in open source, you know this. Commit emails are the best way to have people realize what other people are working on. Most open source projects do not review each other's changes before checking them in. What happens is, somebody builds up trust, they get commit access, they start committing patches into the version control system, and people trust that they're not screwing things up. And what happens then is an email goes out and it goes into everyone's mailbox, all the other developers, and they can sort of see, oh, here's what this person's doing. And depending on their level of interest, they might review the code or not. But the fact that it pushes these code reviews in people's face is a huge deal, much more likely to get participation in code review than developers going in and reading what someone else has already done. So that is a very important technique. And another thing you should not do is let people submit power plants. Another use of the term power plant here, but same basic idea. Don't let developers go off for 3 months in the corner and quietly develop some huge mega feature and then suddenly appear one day and commit the whole thing. And it's so big, nobody can review it. Nobody has the time or the energy to even understand what it's doing. And that's terrible, because you want everyone in your project to know what's going on in pretty much every corner of the code, and not just one person who might get hit by a bus. And then how are you going to support that feature? So this is part of just keeping people in the loop. And the way to do that is, say, hey, I'm going to work on this feature for 3 months. Let me do it on a branch over here, and you guys can watch me do it incrementally without disrupting the rest of you. So don't be afraid of branches. Oh, I just said that. So that's it. Bus factor. You want to tell them what a bus factor is?
Sure. So I wrote an article about the bus factor. The bus factor of your project, or a part of your project, is the number of developers that have to get hit by a bus to leave you in a world of crap. So, for example, Subversion's file system code, the Berkeley DB file system code, for a while had a bus factor of 1. And that was Mike Pilato, and we were a little bit worried about him because he crossed the street frequently. So what did we do to prevent this? Is we did our best to start working to lower the barrier to start working on the Berkeley DB file system. We went through and made sure that the code was commented well and as clear as possible. Mike wrote a couple different design docs expressing what we were doing in there. And we started encouraging. We actually asked some of our developers if anybody was willing to start to work in the file system with Mike and take a look at that. And some people took us up on that. Yeah,
that's right. Encourage people to spread their expertise around. Absolutely.
Because, I mean, and being hit by a bus, I joke about actually Mike being run over by a bus, but being hit by a bus can take any number of forms. Someone can have a new job, someone can have a baby, someone can get married, lifestyle change, life status change, any of that sort of thing can take them away from your project, because most of the time you are dealing with volunteers.
And this leads into the general idea of the egalitarianism we're talking about, people not owning certain parts of the code base. It's okay to be an expert on certain parts of the code base, but what you'll often see happening both inside corporations and in open source projects, certain people sort of marking off their territories and saying, this is mine and you can't touch it unless you talk to me. And that is a very, very bad for collaboration. So one of the ways you can discourage that is do not let people put their names at the top of source code files. There are plenty of chances for attribution. There's always a file that describes who the main contributors to the project are. There's always the change log, the history on the version control system records who commits what when. You can annotate the code and see who wrote what when. So it's not that you're not going to get credit for what you're doing if somebody isn't looking. But if as soon as you see a name in a file, it makes somebody nervous. It makes them think, uh-oh, should I really be trying to fix this bug here without, am I stepping on somebody's toes? If everything's anonymous, it really feels like everybody owns everything else, and that's a great practice.
And even worse than that is at what point do I put my name in the file problem? Is it a 2-line change? Is it a 4-line change? I reformatted the code. I wrote a comment.
Right.
It winds up to be a lot of I think more petty stuff that you just don't have time for. You don't want to focus on that.
Exactly. So what's the example of the date parser?
Oh, the date parser contributor. So we had a guy come up who's actually a very competent engineer, wrote some good code for Subversion, because Subversion used the CVS date parser. Which was kind of a mess, but we went ahead with that, and he came through and he said, okay, I see you guys want to rewrite this, clean it up a little bit, make it something a little more maintainable, and so he wrote this code, this whole file worth of code, and he put his name at the top, and he sent it as a patch for code review. And we went through and reviewed it, and we're like, okay, fix this. This is a style issue in our code, blah 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 blah, and pull your name out of the top. We don't put names in files. He said, well, what do you mean? I wrote the whole file. I want my name in the file. We said, well, no, you don't understand. This is how we do it. It's documented. Point out the documentation in our hacking document of how to hack Subversion, and that's just how we do it. You don't see names in any other files anywhere. And he's like, well, I don't care. I wrote this whole file. If I'm going to contribute it, I want my name in it. So blackmail.
basically.
And we said, that's great. You take your date parser and take it with you. And find another project who will take it with your name in it, because we don't want the code. We're not willing to sacrifice our community tenets for your ego. So it's hard to say no sometimes, too, especially when somebody writes good code.
But the health of the community is more important than one particular bug fix or feature at a given moment. It's looking at the long term rather than the short term.
And another engineer will come by and write it for you eventually, and that did happen.
Yep.
Just took a little longer.
Yep. Okay. Well-defined processes. So this is sort of goes without saying, but not all open source projects really are very professional about how they manage the software. They don't necessarily maintain release branches. They don't necessarily even have a release process. And it depends on the size and scope and maturity of the project. But as the project grows, you need to start thinking about these things and figure out, well, how are we going to release people? How are we going to manage bugs if they come out? Are we going to release bug fixes to people? So it's something to think about. And then you also need to think about how to get more people in the community. So people always start out coming to the community and say, you know, I've patched this little problem here. Here's my patch, and they post it to the email list. And you want to be welcoming to them, right? I mean, you want your community to grow and be healthy, and you want to help. You want to not ignore them. So in some cases, sometimes the community's so busy they completely drop patches on the floor. People come in, offer them, they get ignored. That's bad. One way to fix that is to actually assign somebody in your community to notice patches that are being ignored and put them in the bug tracker or respond to the person after a certain amount of time. But then in general, I guess you need to come up with a policy of how are you going to expand your community in a more official sense. What does it mean for someone to be part of the community? Obviously, it means, you know, they're going to have commit access to your source control. That's usually sort of the technical definition of being a member of the community. But there's a lot of other definitions, right? Well, what did you talk about this part? I'm thinking about how the culture perpetuates, right? I mean,
so the culture perpetuates because the kind of people you're going to give commit access to your project are people that are going to be like yourselves. People who have the same values of your software, who are, you know, going to abide by your community rules. They're the kind of people who show up with patches and you'll iterate on different patches with them. And after a while, they're going to start submitting patches that need less attention before they go in. So you switch them from review then commit to commit then review, and the review takes place by the rest of the committers. Yeah. But so it's the self-selecting community. Like as Ben and I sort of go through periods where we do less work with the Subversion community, we come back and keep an eye on things, and it's the same sort of flavor to the community of people.
The tone of the mailing list, right? Yeah.
And now the anecdote that we have for this is that even a founder can be booted. So we've talked about this in the past with each other about what happens if somebody kind of goes crazy. You know, you can remove someone's commit access if the group of committers votes on that. I'm familiar with an open source project where the founder wrote almost all the code for the project. And then it became a larger open source project and consensus based, and it attracted a community and people did things and releases. And one day the founder decided he wanted to do something different with the software, and that he was going to go this direction, and the whole community wanted to go this direction, but they were afraid of angering him. They felt like, you know, he was the founder, and they sort of had to kind of do what he did, but they really wanted to go this way. And they told him that, and he threatened them. He said, I'm going to veto everything you do and prevent you from doing a release, because I'm going to, you know, put my foot down and prevent them from happening. And a couple of the guys talked to me like, you know, what do we do? I'm like, you vote and you throw him out. I'm like, let him, if he wants to take his toys in a certain direction that 10 other people don't want to go in, well, you know, it's great that he's a founder. Sure, you have a lot of respect for him, but he's not showing respect for your community. He's come in and decided that he wants to take charge. And if you have a benevolent dictatorship of a community, that's one thing. But if you're working in a consensus-based environment where everyone, it's sort of where there's no one guy that takes care of everything.
It just goes to show that a poisonous person can suddenly appear from within. It doesn't have to be an outsider coming into your community.
Right.
Somebody can go crazy.
And that's one of the reasons that we both like consensus-based development, because there's no one who's working on the actual code that's disenfranchised. If everyone who's writing the code has a say in the direction of the code as a whole, then you feel like you have much more control over your future.
Yeah, absolutely. So every consensus-based community usually has some kind of a voting system, at least written into their charter, how they participate. And this I think what really started was Apache was the first major set of projects to do this. And a lot of people will look at this and say, oh, well, we should just vote on everything, right? And that is not a good idea either. A really healthy community, if you're having good, healthy discussions, you are coming to resolutions relatively easily on most subjects. If you find yourself voting on everything all the time, something is wrong, and you need to be a little more introspective.
Voting means there's a winner and a loser.
Voting means there's a winner, exactly. I mean, people need to learn to make compromises, and hopefully you are bringing people into your community who are the kind of people who like to make compromises and are willing to deal with that. If you're voting, then you have a very strange culture, I suppose. Certainly in the Subversion Project, I think we were going for maybe 4 or 5 years before we had our first actual vote, where we actually really all sat down and took tallies and was very, very careful about counting who was on what side. And this really, really critical decision we had to make was how to format our source code, whether to put spaces before parentheses or not. People were very, very passionate about this. But if that's the only vote you ever have, then you know you're in good shape, right? So I find it humorous that was our one big vote.
We had committers calling out of the woodwork we hadn't seen. Ben emailed one guy, we hadn't committed to Subversion a year or so, and said, oh my God, come, you have to vote for this. And the guy came in and voted against Ben. So that was... Yeah, there
was politicking, definitely. So, all right, let's talk about how to notice people. Usually it's obvious. It's not always obvious. This phrase bozo bit is what Fitz says if he's reading a mailing list and it becomes obvious that somebody we're talking with is really just going to suck and drain our time and we're never going to get anywhere. He just says, I flipped the bozo bit and just stops responding to the thread.
Now I have to say that this is where
he's a bad cop.
This is where I explain that I'm the bad cop and Ben's the good cop. I read 2 mails from a guy. I'm like, oh God, this guy's a bozo, and Ben's like, oh come on, no, we have to email him, and hey, he's good. And it's important to be tolerant because this guy who shows up and seems to be a bozo on his first 1 or 2 emails, he might just be engaging you. And he could turn out to be a very valuable committer, and that has happened in the past. So
I think it's good to have both bad and good cops in your community, right? People screaming when to watch out for problems, but then other people who are willing to go a little farther in tolerating.
And thick skin helps too.
Thick skin. So here's some really obvious ways to tell that somebody might be not worth your time. And the first telltale signs you'll see in the way they communicate, right? You'll see that their email address is like Crazy Joe 53 woo or something. I mean, it's just like, what? And then they join IRC and they have a completely different ridiculous nickname, and you don't even realize it's the same person. Yes, I just said that. Capital letters, all this. You've seen this before, so just be careful of these folks. This gives a spam score. That's pretty high.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, Fitz.
Some people, again, I talked about engaging the community. Some people might show up and not be able to pick up on the mood. For example, if we are in the final crunch to release, we were in the final crunch to release for Subversion 1.0, and people are trying our best to focus on getting our release. I mean, Subversion did take 4 years to get to 1.0. Granted, our 1.0 is 5.6 for some software. It's version control. You lose people's data, they're not coming back.
Be very careful.
Yeah, so we had somebody come in, we're in this last crunch, and they're like, I think you should completely rewrite your back end from scratch. We're like, it's great. Why don't you come back tomorrow? So they just obviously don't understand. They don't pick up on the tone. They don't see the what you're doing. They ask a lot of questions that they could be looking up, and that shows an impotence mismatch, but it also shows could be an indication of a lack of respect for other people's time.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes you'll see people who are openly hostile. These happen. They're not as common as you think, but it does happen. They'll come in and say, this project is ridiculous. It's the worst thing I've ever seen. I can't believe you guys are doing X, Y, Z. You did it all
memory
wrong.
Pools? Are you kidding me? You don't use malloc and free?
Yeah, we did have somebody submit a patch once, and he didn't like the way he used malloc and free, for those of you who are C programmers, and we were using memory pools, and we said, you'll have to rewrite this using the memory system we're using, and he said, well, this is ridiculous, this is so stupid, I'm not going to do this, and walked away. Okay, fine, I guess it wasn't a good match for our community anyway. But sometimes you'll see people who have a sense of entitlement. They'll come in and say, well, I'm going to write this feature, and I demand that you help me right now. And what is wrong with this thing, and what's wrong? Why isn't this working for me? Tell me now. Again, disrespecting people's time. bad attitude. Blackmail. Sometimes people will come to the community and say, well, I like your project, but it doesn't have this feature, so unless you add this feature, I'm not going to have my Fortune 500 company use it, or I was going to contribute 10 of my best developers to work on it, but it's not the way we like it, so you lose. I mean, there's nothing you can do about that. Once again, you think about the long term and not the short term. What is the direction you want for your project? What do you want your community to be like? Don't let people blackmail or hijack those long-term goals from you. Yeah. It's easy. Sometimes you can see people are just trolling, just trying to get rile you up, and you need to ignore that. And then this is my favorite. You'll actually see if somebody gets identified as a poisonous person, and the community just starts to sort of ignore the person, hoping they'll go away. One of the first reactions you'll see is that it's a cabal, and obviously this small group of people has hijacked the project because they're not interacting with me anymore, and they'll make wonderful conspiracy accusations, and it's amusing, and it's also very sad. But yeah, be on the lookout for that. Go ahead.
All right, so you do wind up with a lot of conceited developers who aren't going to acknowledge the opinions of other people. I've been doing this for so many years and this and that, and I clearly understand more about it than you do. And your opinions are great, but you don't matter. And they're going to make sweeping claims about the project's success. This is my favorite. They're like, if Subversion integrates with Ant, it would take over the world. And we're like, yeah, that's great. Come back tomorrow. They'll pull open these topics that you've gone over years ago and whatnot, and basically you've got to put them to the archives because they haven't read through the archives, and that's understandable if someone hasn't necessarily read your archives. But when you point them to the archives, then they come back and they say, yeah, but no, yeah, it's different, and blah blah blah, and I've got cold fusion, and again, it's a matter of having the strength of your community to not be so desperate for people that you could say my community and our values are more important than this other warm or semi-warm body in some cases might be.
Keep going. I like these slides.
So a lot of people are willing to complain and not help fix. These are the talkers and not the doers. These people you have to ignore or ask to leave, or make it understand that this is a development list and this is not a group therapy session. Some people just want to, some cases, some people want to be heard, especially if there's a real bug in question. In that case, that's a role of working people into the issue tracker and that sort of thing and letting them know they're heard. But if they're going to go ahead and complain, or they want to go off and write a whole pile of code by themselves, because everybody likes to code, but who wants to sit down and discuss a design with the people who've been working the product?
You might have to argue with someone.
And so you want to argue, and like, whatever, I'm going to go off and write this code, and I'll come back, and I'll let you see it when I'm done, and that's great. I'll be glad to press the delete key when you're done, because you haven't taken the time to talk to us about it. Ben and I, when we wrote the locking feature for Subversion, we easily spent twice as much time designing the two parts of the locking feature than we did coding it, because there's a lot of discussion went into what exactly it was and why it was there and what it would do.
That's always usually the harder part, is coming up with the design than the code.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of communication. I mean, communication skills are of key importance.
So the people who tend to complain a lot but not actually do anything, our usual response to them is patches welcome.
Patches welcome.
Which is a common phrase you might hear in the open source world.
It's the open source way of saying, go screw yourself.
Well, if you don't like the person, yeah. So if they come back with a patch, that's great. But usually they'll just either put up or shut up, and they will go away. It depends.
Kind. If you're going to be kind, you would say, hey, could you write a patch for that?
Right.
And then if you're annoyed with them, you'll say, patch is welcome, in quotes, and that's usually the go away sign.
Yeah, people are also, they're not thick-skinned. You'll run into these people, and these people are never going to survive in open source in general. And I don't know how to help them other than to say, learn to divorce yourself from the argumentation. Your opinion is valid, but it's not the only opinion out there, and it's not all personal. And those people tend to not function well. So talking about disinfecting your community, what happens if somebody's already in your community and you need to deal with this problem and they're disrupting your attention and focus? All right, so assess the damage. So the two questions you need to ask yourself is, how are they affecting your attention and focus? at some point, you start questioning and you say, look, we've spent a lot of time arguing with this person. They might be a member of the community, they might be a new person to the community, but at some point, you're going to have to wonder and say, is this going to terminate? Does it seem like this process is going to terminate? Is it going to help the project in the long term? And often you'll be sort of surprised and say, you know what, this could go on forever. And it's hard to step back. And sometimes we need to kick each other and say, look, you're wasting your time talking to this person. You used to throw objects at me if I spent too long talking to certain people. And the other question is, are they actually distracting the project right now? Like, are you falling behind in the forward momentum of your project because of this one or two people? These aren't questions that you always ask yourself. Usually you're so caught up in the discussion you don't step back and notice. But take a look at it. It's important. Go ahead.
So so our first list of things is not to do as part of your open source project. You don't want to feed the energy creature. Somebody comes up and they're looking for a fight, and all you got to do is take a swing at them and it's on. So the first thing you do is you just ignore them. If someone's obviously trolling, you ignore them. If they're trolling and have something valuable to say, then it's great. Concentrate on what they're saying that's valuable. Ignore the other thing. You don't want to give these jerks a gripping surface, basically, because that's what they're looking for. So don't engage them on that. Don't get emotional. Stick to the facts. Our first example.
Well, the first example that at least I ran into is we were very far along in Subversion, and somebody appeared on the list and basically gave us a very long lecture about how our entire design and goals were completely wrong, and we should start over and follow his lead. And it wasn't done in a way that you were like, this is a crackpot. He actually had some real argumentation going on in there.
It was a crackpot.
Well, it turned out to be a crackpot later, but we didn't know that. but it looked like some very serious discussion, questioning the whole foundation of the project. And this was, very far into the project. So I and a couple other people I know got very emotional and started responding, extremely emotionally, getting very into it, and disrupted. And I lost 2 or 3 days of work, just arguing with this person, and it got really upsetting. And ultimately, all we could do is, in the end, we just had to sort of walk away from the discussion because we knew we weren't going to budge.
And when you did,
he was draining us.
He walked away as well.
He walked away as well. That's right. So, be careful. Don't let the emotional drain paralyze you. Good things you should do.
Good cop.
Yeah, good cop. So. Pay attention to newcomers. Sometimes people come to the list and they'll look like trolls. And in fact, if you look carefully, sometimes it's just a language barrier. Maybe they're not speaking English as their native language. Sometimes there's just a little bit of miscommunication that's not going on. And you need to give them a benefit of a doubt, at least for a few exchanges before you really say, well, this person's a troll. Because you'll find out that sometimes, they'll actually have useful things to tell you. If it's a very emotional email that comes into your list or your IRC channel, try to ignore the emotion and say, what is this person really getting at? Maybe they found a bug, but they're so upset, it's hard to see that they're really reporting a bug here or some new use case you haven't thought of already. So what is the example here of our raving lunatic?
So we had a raving lunatic
I like that.
Show up on our list one day, accusing us of not knowing how to write code, of how could we possibly ship a product that has a bug like this, and we're just a bunch of complete losers.
Shame on us.
And shame on you. And this person is actually pretty well known in the open source community, and some of us had respect for this person up to this point, some of us didn't. But they actually had a valid bug, and I was so proud because I came into this a day late. And the first response was from another Subversion developer saying, I think you're right on this bug here. I think this is where it's going like this. And, I think we can address this by this. I've opened an issue and we're going to track this. And the person came back with more vitriol. Well, you shouldn't have shipped this in the first place. And how could you possibly have not seen this, you losers?
All bile.
And all
just
bile.
bile.
And then I did this and this happened. And then the other person responded, oh, okay, so if this happened, then what it looks like is happening is it's a mismatch with this version, blah, blah, blah.
Completely calm.
And I've written a patch for it, and we're going to review it and see if this is it. And then the person came back with more stupidity and vitriol.
Yeah, but what was great here, it was so great to watch this in action. One half of the conversation just outlandish, insane emotional anger, and then all the responses from our community just being extremely calm and quiet and rational and ignoring everything. It was fantastic. And the guy went away. It had no effect on us
And
whatsoever.
we got a bug fix too.
Yeah.
We got a bug report and we got it fixed. And
But he ended up looking like the idiot, really.
he looked like
right?
a real idiot. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he had a real bug.
So yeah, sometimes you do have to ignore. I mean, you won't always be able to extract a bug report from the person, or I'm trying to remember which example was this.
This is pre 1.0. Wasn't this the rewrite? No.
Yeah, I think it was the rewrite.
Yeah, this was the same rewrite guy.
It was the same. It was another one of the same guys, the one who said we should start over from scratch and follow his design.
So you ignored him, and
yeah, we just ignored him. I mean, and then sometimes they can be so awful you have to forcibly boot one from the community. There was one person who came to our mailing list who seemed sort of like an eager student, and he was very excited to participate in the Subversion project, and he wanted to help out, and he had all these ideas, and he said, all right, well, tell me which documents to read, and he started reading all the documents. And then this strange thing happened. Every hour, he started posting questions to the development mailing list. Well, how do I do this? And have you thought about this? And they were all sort of well-intentioned questions, but and he obviously had a respect for us, but I don't think he realized that he was draining our attention because he wanted essentially someone to hold his hand and sort of walk him through and be a tutor. And we actually fell into it for a while. We started saying, oh, look here. We were trying to be very, very nice because he was being so nice as well. And then I think it was Fitz who noticed maybe a couple weeks later, or maybe just a week later even.
No, it was a month.
It was about a full month. What did you do? What happened?
It was a full month later. I'm like, God, this guy's just showing up all over the place. So I wrote a little program that went through my mail spool for the last month and picked out the top 5 posters. And 4 of those posters were committers. And one of those posters was this person, and he was the number 2 poster to our mailing list. And then I did a little further investigation, and over half of the committers' posters were follow-ups to this guy.
Yeah.
So I did a little bit of politicking here, and just because I wanted to be sensitive and see what other people thought, I sent these statistics out because nothing beats hard data. I sent these little statistics out to some other committers. I said, look, this guy's really sucking a lot of time. I think that we should actually gently ask him to leave. What do you think about this? Am I off base? And they took a look at the numbers and they're like, oh yeah, I think it's time to take drastic measures. And Carl Fogel, being like the nicest person in the universe.
Very diplomatic.
Very diplomatic. Spent like an hour with this guy on the phone, gently asking him to just stop posting to our mailing list. And the guy still didn't understand it.
It was sad. I mean, he ended up leaving, but he didn't understand. No matter how much we explained, he didn't understand he was draining our attention.
Yeah.
And
that was the hardest one to deal with, and I think that's the only person we've ever actually directly asked.
Well, we did revoke commit access once in the early days.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
So repel trolls with niceness. This is another case sort of similar to the IRC situation we described, where similar to the email situation, but this was an IRC. Somebody just came into our IRC channel where the developers hang out, and I think we said, well, I think this is ridiculous. I started using Subversion because I was forced to use it, and I think it's awful, and this is terrible, and what's wrong with this?
They couldn't build in BSD.
Yeah, or he couldn't build. Was it? Oh, that's right. He couldn't build on BSD. It's right. I can't build. This isn't working. What's wrong with you guys? And the response, of course, was very, very helpful, quiet. Oh well, have you tried this? Have you tried this? And he's trying to get a rise out of us. It becomes obvious after a little while that he's trying to say things to just get us angry. And we're just completely ignoring him. And finally, the last thing he says, what was the quote?
He's like, if you guys aren't going to be like, fight, I'm out of here. I came here to argue. And
really bizarre.
We were like sitting there looking at each other, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what just happened, but it happened.
So, what's our, this is summing it all up. Remember to preserve your attention and focus. That's what you are guarding. That is the long-term health of the project in the community. Then you need to fortify your community by having good community practices. Pretty obvious. We talked about all those. Then you need to be on the lookout for people coming in. And then if people do get in, don't be afraid to boot them out or to stick up for your culture no matter what the cost. You need to be confident in that. And that pretty much sums it up. However, Fitz.
Well, actually, we have a little bit of a secret to tell after all this. We're talking about open source, and next slide might
Next slide.
So this doesn't actually just apply to open source communities. This applies to any community. This applies to communities at work. This applies to social communities.
Your church group.
Your church group, your knitting circle, whatever the case might be. And it's sort of like, we gave this talk earlier this year to the Summer of Code Mentors Summit, where all the Google Summer of Code mentors came in, and it was like this huge group therapy hoedown, because we're like, and then we had this jerk that did this, and like 10 people in the audience would go like, I know that guy, I know what you're talking about. We had him show up at our community and do the same thing, or we had someone like that, So this is sort of thing that applies. I mean, and you can look for these kind of peoples in your everyday work or anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's it for our slides, but we do have time for questions and answers if people want to talk about.
If you have answers, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, tell us
we'd
the
ask
answers.
you, any Googlers in the audience, to keep things non-Google specific, since this is an open source talk to the public.
Yeah.
All right there. Is that mic on back there? No? Okay, we'll repeat your question.
You were talking about the most recent anecdote about the guy who was kind of a drain and wanted to tutor and ask a million questions and whatnot. I haven't looked at been on the subversion list and also not familiar with the project, but it's old and it's big, and I imagine that the archives are huge. So what, how do you can't just tell the new guy, go read the archives. It's like, go read the Bible.
So the question is how do you tell someone to read the archives when the archives are gigantic and
Some amount of tutoring is, appropriate.
yeah.
So how do you read when someone needs to learn something about your community, how do you tell them to read the archives if your archives are so big? The first thing is that if you're going to point them to a specific conversation, give them a link directly to that conversation. The second part of that is that you have to continuously document your project from day one till the present day. And so if there's something important that happens, like I said, a design decision, a mistake, or something has changed in your community, you need to document that. The subversion hacking document, as it's called, started off as about, 3 pages long.
Well, it was about how to contribute some patches.
It's like, 70 pages long? I mean, it's an HTML document that goes from here to New York. And it's pretty big.
But it describes a lot of things. It describes a lot of how to participate in the community, how to contribute patches, what we expect the patches to look like, how to participate in email conversation etiquette, right? And it talks about our release procedure too.
Yeah,
right?
it talks about just about all that, but we've also got various design docs sprinkled throughout. Our code's is commented in great detail. And not to take too much credit, but Ben and I are two of the 3 authors of the main Subversion book, which is free.
It's the main project documentation.
Yeah, you can purchase the treeware version of it, but it's free and it's very detailed. And Ben started it actually, and that is one of the things that helped us a lot, not only to avoid repeating questions, but to gaining market share in the first place. Because people would come and say, "Oh, there's this piece of software. There's this awesome docs."
If you're well documented, then 99% of the time when somebody asks for help, there will be a really relevant link you can give to them. And if that's not the case, then you know what needs to be written, right? So. You're saying of the 4 things listed on the slides, which one is going to be the detriment of Riser FS?
I'm not familiar with the project, so I can't really
You mean this,
on that.
or the the respect, humility?
You mean the respect, humility? No.
Oh, right. Oh, that guy.
So there's a poisonous person.
No.
I'm just kidding.
I know who he's talking about, yeah. He had lack of respect for people.
On a serious note, you're talking about how you don't want to suck up all the energy from being online and talking. What about having somebody who's like a project manager who doesn't code, manages everything?
So the question was, what do you think about having a project manager who just sort of manages the community and doesn't do any code? And interestingly, I worked at my last job, basically 5 years being paid to work on Subversion, and it started out almost entirely coding, and by the time I got to the last couple of years, I was spending about 60% of my time doing community management, 40% of my time coding, and that's just what it took to keep the project healthy and functioning. So you'll find, I've never heard of a project that actually has explicit community managers, but what you'll find is in healthy projects, maybe Open Office does,
sure.
But it's rather unusual. Usually what will happen is certain members of the community who are also very good coders will sort of fall into the role of also being police and preservers of culture and tone. And Carl Fogel's especially good at that, right?
And non-coders typically wind up doing things to sort of serve the needs of the project as a whole, as opposed to setting direction. Open source projects are notoriously bottoms up, and direction is set by the people writing the code. And I think that's one of the things that I find very appealing about open source.
You need to have a lot of respect and credit already to be culture police. So I don't think it's the simple case of saying, hey, you over here, why don't you monitor our lists? That person needs to be a pretty well-respected member of the community already, and if they decide to do that on their own, that's great. But it's different than sort of saying, hey, why don't you over there manage our patches and make sure we don't ignore any patches that come through, which is a very technical job, and you don't need a lot of respect for that.
Sure. Any other questions? Dan.
So you're active in open source, and you also have jobs in open software. What do you see as significant differences between how open software works and how software or coding works?
So the question is, how do you see how open source communities function, I guess, versus closed source within corporations, right?
I think it depends vastly on the company. Google's a very bottom-up company, and I think it works a lot like open source communities do.
Which is unusual.
Which is extremely unusual. So I think a lot of it depends on the company culture and the founders and a whole lot of other different things.
I think, from what I've seen, many corporations are very much the opposite. They're very tops down. Nobody knows what anyone else is working on. Not necessarily. You have decisions being made at the highest level, and they trickle down. And there isn't really a sense of community in the same way that you see in an open source community. And so as a result, a lot of these dysfunctions will sort of creep in. You'll see people establishing fiefdoms over certain areas of code. You'll see people fighting with each other sort of maybe in a passive-aggressive way when they should be collaborating. So that's something that corporations need to watch out for. Culture of trust is hard to get to.
Yes?
How much do you need to meet in person in order to have deep design discussions and also build on the kinds of relations?
So the question is, how much do you need to meet in person to have deep design discussions and general discussions about your project? You don't really need to meet at all, but it's going to take a lot more time if you don't meet at all.
It's a question of bandwidth, I think, right? I mean, email is pretty low bandwidth. IRC is better bandwidth. Telephone's even better. Being face-to-face is best yet. And I think what a common pattern you'll see is a lot of open source projects start out with maybe just 2 or 3 people in the same room coming up with a design and a set of goals and a mission and whatnot. Then they go off to the internet, and once that ball gets rolling, it's easier to add people in because the bandwidth needed isn't as high anymore. A lot of design decisions have already been made. But that's common. It's a common pattern.
The developers didn't have a face-to-face meeting until last year. That was the first summit of all the developers. We had the CollabNet employees. The 4 of us shared an office in Chicago, and we had discussions offline and whatnot. But we always brought we never made decisions offline. Decisions were always made in the mailing list, because it's not fair to developers in different time zones, in different places, that sort of thing.
That's one of the things. One of the rules, at least of our community, is that you can talk all you want face to face or an IRC, but it's not an official discussion until it happens on the mailing list because we want to include everybody.
And that's where decisions were always made. So we would have these meetings face to face in our office, and then usually Ben or Carl would do this long write-up to the list of what we discussed, and then the discussion would start in earnest there, and then decisions would be made there with the rest of our committers present. And the one thing now, I didn't work for CollabNet until 4 years in 2004, even though I was a committer since almost since the beginning of Subversion. And one of the things that they did right was that they had 4 people they paid full-time, 4+ people they paid full-time to work on Subversion, but these people never had a magical trump card that said, we're going to do this. It was always a consensus-based, consensus-driven development, and that certainly came up with different things than you guys would have gone with on your own.
There was the consensus of the community was more important than the fact that the corporation happened to be paying people to work on it, which is a hard tension to balance. I remember we hired somebody a 5th person to work. Well, when we hired Mike Pilato to work for our company, hired him to work on Subversion, just like the rest of us. And his first day, he's like, "Well, what do you mean I can't submit code?" Well, I'm like, "Well, you have to. The community has to vote you in. You have to prove that you know what's going on." And he was sort of stunned, since he was being paid to work on this. He had to earn.
You had to send patches.
And he had just
else.
like anyone else. He had to earn trust from everyone. His employer was irrelevant.
Yeah.
Other questions?
One last question?
Maybe one more? Okay. I guess not.
All right.
Great.
Well, thank all of you
Yeah,
for
thank
coming.
you.
It was really great to talk to you. We'll be here for a few minutes to chat if you have any other questions.